I'm a product manager at Google. It's kind of a bold move to be here at a Swift conference talking about Flutter, but I want to focus my talk today on how Flutter specifically integrates with iOS tooling. So Apple's frameworks, the Swift programming language, and Xcode and other frameworks that are used in Apple's developer tooling. Okay, nice to see all of you. My name is Leigha. I'm a product manager at Google working on Flutter. So I'm really excited to see everyone here. I was just saying, I was pretty nervous that no one was going to show up. I'm not going to lie. I'm talking about Flutter at a Swift conference. There are all these great talks about SwiftUI, and I feel like sometimes there's a little bit of animosity between SwiftUI and cross-platform frameworks. So I'm really excited that you all chose to be here and you're interested in learning a little bit about Flutter. So thank you. All right, so you all probably know the Swift logo, which is a bird, but Flutter also has a bird logo. We have this cute little mascot whose name is Dash, and you see her like all over Dart and Flutter's websites, and everyone who's like a Google developer expert gets a little plush Dash. It's really cute. Anyway, like I said, it's kind of a bold move to be here at a Swift conference talking about Flutter, but I want to focus my talk today on how Flutter specifically integrates with iOS tooling. So Apple's frameworks, the Swift programming language, and Xcode and other frameworks that are used in Apple's developer tooling. So oftentimes when I'm talking to developers, I'm at a Google event. Right, so I talk to a lot of Android developers, maybe there are some web developers, but I rarely get the chance to talk to iOS-focused developers. So that's why I'm here today. Okay, so for those who don't know much about Flutter, it's a cross-platform UI framework. So you use Flutter to paint pixels on the screen. You're creating the UI of your apps, and most of our developers are using it to deploy to both Android and iOS from a single code base. But we also support other platforms, so you can deploy to web, you can deploy to Windows, to Linux, to Mac, and also we offer this like custom embedding feature where you can create your own embedder, and lots of people have used this to do like cool IoT stuff, and different car manufacturers are using Flutter to actually paint the pixels you see on the screen in your car. But today I want to talk a little bit about Flutter's architecture. So oftentimes when we think about cross-platform frameworks, we think of kind of like this abstraction over the native UI layer. But Flutter's architecture is really different from that. So there's this misconception that kind of like Flutter might wrap around UIKit views or SwiftUI views. But Flutter's architecture is all powered by talking directly to the GPU. So it goes to really low-level commands on the device. So we have kind of like 3 layers of the architecture. And at the top, we have the Flutter Framework. And this is what you're using to write your app code, right? Similar to SwiftUI in that it's declarative. And I have this quick little example. So in SwiftUI, if I want to create like a horizontal layout, and I want to have like a little globe icon, and then it's to say hello world, I use HStack, I use image, I use text, and these are views, right? And Flutter looks pretty similar. So like I said, it's declarative, which means that it's easy to understand, it's easy for developers to pick up, you can work pretty quickly. And Flutter is composed of UI components called widgets. So essentially, a Flutter widget is very similar to a SwiftUI view. So I have row, and then I have to say children, and then I have an icon widget and my text widget. And that Cupertino bit, we just use that to refer to like iOS style widgets. So we have iOS style icons that are built into the framework. And I pulled these examples from this guide that we wrote not too long ago called Flutter for SwiftUI Developers. And it talks a lot about the similarities and differences between the framework itself. And we have another one for the programming languages, so comparing Swift and Dart. And we also have one that's specifically for concurrency because things get so crazy when you're talking about that stuff. All right, so that was the framework. I'm not going to pay too much attention to the framework today because I want to talk more about how Flutter integrates with Apple's tooling. So I mentioned that Flutter is different from a lot of other cross-platform frameworks in that it talks directly to the GPU by sending really low-level commands to Apple. So it does this through the engine. And the engine is what's responsible for taking your UI code and translating it into the pixels that you actually see on the screen. It actually does a couple of different things. It packages the Dart runtime. It handles system events like gestures on the touch screen or like when you flip your phone up and down. But the main part is that renderer, which, like I said, is responsible for rendering your widgets onto the screen. And I just want to call out one project that we've been working on, which I'm really excited about, called Impeller. We just totally rewrote our entire rendering engine. Before we were using this more general purpose rendering engine called Skia, but now we've written our own and it's called Impeller, and right now it's available in preview on iOS only, but people are really excited about it. It's had really great improvements in terms of performance, so yeah, I'll be talking more about Impeller at Google's I/O next week also if you want to tune in. So Impeller is composed of a bunch of different layers, and I won't go into the technical details, but the bottommost layer is called the hardware abstraction layer. And this is where we actually take the low-level commands for rendering different pieces of UI, and we translate them into rendering pipelines depending on the different device that the app is being run on. So for iOS, we're actually taking the Flutter UI commands and translating them directly to Metal pipelines. So that's one way that Flutter integrates with Apple's frameworks, by directly talking to Metal in a really similar way that native frameworks might do so. And what this offers developers is control of every pixel on the screen. So you're essentially handed this blank canvas, and Flutter's framework really strives to be super flexible, giving you pretty low-level access to create really custom things. So we have this cool app that's available in the App Store called Wondrous, and it's completely open source. You can see all the code in GitHub. It follows best practices for accessibility and cross-platform design and adaptive design, but it has these really cool animations and beautiful graphics, and it's just a real testament of the sort of custom experiences that you can bring to life with Flutter. I have a video here, but it doesn't want to play. Oop. Come on, play. All right, well, I'll show you all later. It was a really cool 3D animation of Dash, so I'm sad it's not working. The Wi-Fi in here, I think, is a little spotty. But anyway, Impeller is completely open source like the rest of Flutter. And we created this kind of layered architecture with the hope that really smart engineers in the wild are going to go dig into these APIs and create their own custom rendering solutions. And we built a proof of concept of this by creating this really cool 3D renderer that still feels fluttery and declarative. So in the framework, I can use a GLB file, which is just a 3D model. It's a standard way for representing 3D models. And I can just plug that right into a widget in Flutter. And then I can do things that I would do with other Flutter widgets, like apply animations or transformations. So like I said, this is kind of a proof of concept of the sorts of things that you can do. It's really sad that it's not loading, but find me after, or you can watch videos on YouTube. Okay, so that was Flutter's architecture, and we talked a little bit about it integrating with Metal and kind of those low-level GPU commands. But I also mentioned that this is a Swift conference, so we probably want to know how Flutter integrates with Swift. So let's walk through the process of creating a brand new Flutter app. So here I'm using VS Code. I've used the command palette to create a brand new Flutter app. It has this nice little app where I can click the button to change the state. Just a quick demo app. And when I create a new Flutter app, it creates this folder, one folder for every platform that I'm targeting. So the iOS folder I have highlighted here, And what I can do is right-click and then open it up directly in Xcode. So over here, I have this Swift file, app delegate, that I have open. And it's using this class called Flutter app delegate. So all this class is doing, it's going and initializing the Flutter engine. It's kind of embedding it in this app, and it's using this Swift file as the root of your app. So essentially, you have this like native Swift app that's just a blank canvas, and then it's kind of delegating everything to Flutter and embedding the engine so that it can actually run the Dart code and render the frames onto the screen. And this is made possible through some settings in the Xcode project. So I was able to open up this Xcode workspace because the Flutter Create template contains an Xcode workspace that's already configured in certain ways to make the Flutter app run. Right, so I have my runner target. So the runner app is our name for kind of like the root Swift app that we're using. And it has a target in Xcode. And if I go to the build phases, I can see this custom run script that's going to run. And all that does is it goes and compiles our Dart code into one framework. And Dart is special in that it compiles directly to machine code. So it's pretty performant. And it also goes and copies the Flutter framework that has all the bits that you need to actually run Flutter on an iOS device. And it just copies those into the build repository. So I can see the frameworks here. The app framework has all my Dart code, so that's my actual app code that I've written. And then the Flutter framework has all the dependencies that I need. Okay. Woohoo! So now when I want to run my Flutter app, I'm actually not going to do it from Xcode, although I could, because I want to take use of Flutter's great debugging tools. So what I'm showing right here is I've used the Flutter run command in the command line, but I could also use the play button in the IDE. And Flutter has this great feature called hot reload. So yesterday at a SwiftUI talk, someone was mentioning how live previews are such a lifesaver. So Flutter has this kind of, but just running directly on the simulator. So I'm making changes in real time. I'm changing the color of the button. I press R on the keyboard to hot reload, and it maintains the state of the app. But then I can see my changes in real time. So it's great. So like I said, this is powered by running the Flutter run command. But actually, what that's doing is running Xcode. So it's running Xcode build because this is still an iOS app, right? We're still taking advantage of iOS's or Apple's different developer tooling to actually compile our app, just with some customizations from that Xcode build script that we showed before. Okay, so that was just creating like a pretty simple Flutter app, but you also have all these APIs that Apple has, right? All these APIs written in Swift or Objective-C, and it allows me to do things like in-app purchases or connect to Bluetooth, send notifications, and I want to take advantage of those in my Flutter app. But how do I connect to a Swift API if I'm writing code in Dart? So the main way we do this is through something called a federated plugin. So your Flutter app makes API calls to this Dart platform interface. So it's kind of like a wrapper that's written in Dart. And then that kind of federates to the platform it's running on and runs the specific SDK or the API call for that platform. So on iOS, it might make a Swift API call or an Objective-C API call, and then on Android, like Java or Kotlin. And there are something like 35,000 packages available on pub.dev to kind of find everything you might need to access those native APIs. But a lot of times when I'm talking to iOS developers, people get kind of nervous. Oh, sorry. I also have this, this doc that we published to make it super easy to find the Apple framework and what the corresponding Flutter plugin is. So that's on our website. But what I was saying before is a lot of times when I talk to iOS developers, they're like, well, WWDC is around the corner and Apple's going to announce some new APIs. How do I take advantage of those brand new ones in Flutter? I have to wait for someone to build a package or a plugin. And this is where method channels come in. So method channels are used in the actual implementation of the plugins. But if you can't find the plugin you need, you can use a method channel directly in your app. And this happened to me a couple months ago. I was trying to do some stuff with like widgets, and I needed the path to my app group container, and I couldn't find that API in any Flutter package that was available. So I can go over to my app delegate that I showed before, and I can just add a function in Swift in this file right here. So here I just created a function to get the container path. It just makes an API call to our file manager to get that. And this method call is now accessible in Dart. So I can just call it in my Dart code. But like I mentioned, Flutter is open source, and we have this great community. We want everyone to contribute to it. So after I did my demo of this thing, I needed it quick. I made my method channel. Then I was like, I should probably open up a PR so that everyone can also access this feature. So that was just a plug for open source. Okay, so that's great, but it still requires like a bit of code because you have to like define the method channel, and then you have to access it in Dart, and then you're kind of like bifurcating your code. But what we're really working on is better interop capabilities. So we're working on this tool that I gave a demo of at our event in January called FFIGen, and it will generate the bindings to access Objective-C or Swift classes automatically. So you have this YAML file, and here I define my classes. So this was a demo of like a pedometer app, so I was mostly using the core motion pedometer class. And I was able to programmatically generate the bindings, and then I can just call those APIs directly in Dart, which is super cool. So we're really focusing a lot on better interop between Swift and Objective-C, so it's even easier to call those native APIs, and you don't have to wait for someone to create a plugin for you to make use of them. Okay, so that was just calling APIs to access different things from Swift or Objective-C. But another thing I hear a lot from iOS developers is like, I don't want to be closed off from other things that Apple's doing, like app extensions. I want Dynamic Island, and I want a home screen widget, right? Everyone loves Dynamic Island. So the cool thing about the root of this being just a native Swift app is that you can do whatever you want to do in Xcode. I can go ahead and add a home screen widget. I can create, like a live activity or dynamic island, and I can add it to my app. So it's super cool. I will caveat this by saying that WidgetKit specifically has a lot of restrictions on the types of views that you can use to draw your UI. Right? It's just a couple of SwiftUI views that are actually allowed. So Flutter itself can't draw the UI. So you do have to write some code in SwiftUI. Probably not a problem for you, all Swift developers. But it is, a trade-off that you have to make. And sometimes that gets annoying because maybe you're rewriting some UI components that you already have in your core app. I think in most cases, home screen widgets are really tiny, so it's probably okay. But I do recognize that concern. One cool thing, so BMW is a Flutter customer, and I put them here because we're right next to the Museum of Auto. So they have created these like nifty little home screen widgets for their Flutter app where you can like control your car directly from the lock screen. And they've also added a watch companion app. So yeah, it's pretty cool. Okay. So that was kind of just integrations with Apple's developer tooling. But let's say you already have your SwiftUI or UIKit app, and you're kind of interested in playing around with Flutter. Maybe you're thinking of migrating your app or just building a new feature in Flutter. You can kind of gradually add Flutter screens to your native iOS app. So let's say I have this app and I want to create a new screen that I've built in Flutter that pops up and asks people to add their like Net Promoter Score. So I've already created this screen in Flutter, and I have a SwiftUI app, and I want to embed it. So there's a couple of different ways I can actually embed my Flutter module. One is CocoaPods. I know probably no one's thrilled about CocoaPods, but bear with me. So you could just add CocoaPods to your SwiftUI app. I add a couple lines to the pod file that basically just manages the dependencies that you need for your Flutter screen. And then back in my SwiftUI app, I am going to pass in, or first I'm going to create the Flutter engine, and then I'm going to pass it in as an environment object, right? So this is just kind of like the root of my app, and I'm passing my Flutter dependencies object in as an environment object. And then in my actual list, which you'll see in a second a demo of, but I have this list in my funny little app. I forget what the app actually is. I think it's like a news app or a music app. So I have this list, and basically when someone's scrolling down the list, I want the Flutter screen to pop up and ask them to add their Net Promoter Score. So I've created this little function that is for opening the Flutter app that I can use directly in my view. And what I have to do is create a Flutter view controller, and that's going to kind of designate that to be the Flutter screen. And I can show a quick little demo. So I scroll down my little app, and then it pops up. Then I'm able to interact with it, and then I can go back to my native app. So it's pretty cool. And this works the other way too. I can embed a SwiftUI view directly into my Flutter app, and this is through something called a platform view. And a lot of plugins will use this, like if there's a Swift SDK, you know, like Apple Maps or something, that's got a visual component to it, and you don't want to have to rewrite that all in Flutter, you can just embed that directly in something called a platform view. And anyway, I would just conclude by saying, like, Flutter isn't perfect, and there are definitely trade-offs when you do experiment with cross-platform. Like I mentioned, having to kind of fall back to native in some places to write Swift code to access an API, or maybe to create a home screen widget. But it's all about trade-offs and what works for you. So yeah. But I'm always looking for feedback from iOS developers. We're genuinely interested in trying to make Flutter a great experience for iOS-focused folks. So feel free to send me messages on LinkedIn or Twitter if you have any questions or thoughts. But thanks.